I would like you to consider the following case. Beth wants to have a child. As a responsible adult, she visits a doctor before conceiving. After giving Beth a physical and running some tests, the doctor arranges to meet with Beth to go over the results. Meeting, the doctor tells Beth that she's healthy and can conceive a child with one small temporary inconvenience. It seems that she has a virus, and this virus creates no symptoms in adults, but it does interfere with fetal development. Specifically, if Beth were to conceive a child now, the virus will interfere with the development of the optic nerve and cause the child to be born blind. However, if Beth waits a couple of months, 2 months at most, the virus will have run its course and Beth can expect a normal, healthy child, subject to the standard risks of any standard pregnancy. Is it wrong for Beth to choose to conceive a child now, even though she knows that the child will be born blind? In other words, does she have a moral obligation to wait for 2 months and have a sighted child instead? Most people who are asked this question says that it would be wrong for Beth to conceive a blind child now. She would be doing something immoral if she refuses to wait. The problem comes from trying to explain why it would be wrong. If conceiving a child now would be wrong, it seems we should be able to identify somebody who would be wronged by her action, somebody who has cause to make a moral complaint against her. Wrongness, it seems, requires a victim. But who is the victim? Would the child, who will be born blind, have grounds to make a moral complaint against Beth? Can the child legitimately complain, "Look what you did to me"? Let's call the child Pebbles. We're asking whether Pebbles has a legitimate moral complaint against her mother for being born blind. But note, the only alternative available for Pebbles is that if her mother had waited, she would not have been born at all. Her options are not to either be born blind or sighted, in which case she would likely prefer to be sighted. Her options are either to be born blind or not born at all. Given these options, and the fact that blind people can live perfectly satisfactory lives, Pebbles likely has reason to be grateful for the life she's been given. She would have preferred to be sighted, but that wasn't an option. Maybe the child that would have been born if Beth had waited is the victim. We'll call him Rocky. Because Beth chose to conceive Pebbles instead, Rocky will never exist. Was a moral wrong committed in the decision not to give life to Rocky? Here we come up against the problem that Rocky has no right to exist. So Rocky can't be wronged by Beth's decision not to conceive him. Imagine that Beth had decided to be childless. Rocky would not exist in that scenario either, yet no moral wrong is committed by women who decide not to have any children. There's no obligation to bring possible future people into existence. A third option to consider is that maybe Beth is victimizing herself. After all, because of her choice, she'll be raising a blind Pebbles rather than a sighted Rocky. But it is her choice. She makes the decision and she bears the cost. Some may argue that her decision is imprudent, but is not thereby immoral. People are free to make imprudent choices. Besides, what moral fault can we attribute to a person who chooses to raise a blind child rather than a sighted child? If somebody who wanted to adopt a baby selected a blind baby from an orphanage rather than a sighted baby, there would be no sense at all in saying that the parents are victimizing themselves by making this particular choice. So maybe society is the victim. After all, society is going to end up with a blind member rather than a sighted member. Now, there may be an argument against Beth if she were to conceive a child that would be a burden on society, that others would then have to spend resources to care for. However, blind people can be contributing members of society. Pebbles probably would not be a drain on the community. So if Beth is doing something wrong by conceiving Pebbles now, rather than waiting for 2 months to conceive Rocky, where is that wrongness? Almost everybody in the community of philosophers, and almost anybody asked whether Beth would be doing something wrong, says that Beth acts immorally if she were to choose to conceive Pebbles rather than Rocky. I have to confess that I'm a part of a very small minority who says that Beth does nothing wrong. If Beth prefers to conceive and raise a blind child, that is her right. The arguments given above show that nobody has grounds for a moral complaint against her. I adopted my position long ago because of what I see to be a very similar type of case that came to my attention when I was in high school. I was told at that time that it would be wrong for me to marry a black woman and conceive a mixed-race child. Note that I'm a white male. The argument that I was given was pretty much the same argument given to Beth. If I were to marry a white person and conceive a white child, that child will have all of the benefits of being white. However, if I were to marry a black person and have a mixed-race child, that child would have the disadvantages of being a mixed-race child. Now, those burdens would largely come from living in a racist society, but that doesn't make them any less real. Hang on to this point. We're going to return to it in a few minutes. I was being told that it would be wrong or selfish of me to choose to conceive a mixed-race child with its disadvantages over a white child that would not have these burdens. It's the same kind of argument as the argument used against Beth, that it would be wrong or selfish of her to choose a blind child with its disadvantages over a sighted child that would not have these disadvantages. My argument against this position goes as follows. Premise 1. If it's wrong for Beth to choose to conceive Pebbles, then it would have been wrong for me to choose to have a mixed-race child. Again, this is built on the assumption that the two cases are morally the same. The person is making a choice to conceive a child whose life will be worse off than that of a different child that one could have chosen to have. Along with this, I add premise 2. The decision to have a mixed-race child is not wrong. This is true even though the disadvantages are quite real. From this, I draw the conclusion that Beth's decision to conceive Pebbles is not wrong. As a matter of general logic, this is a form of logical argument called modus tollens. If an assumption has an implication that's false, then the assumption has to be rejected. If the assumption, Jim committed the murder, implies Jim was in Denver on February 23rd, and Jim was in Denver on February 23rd turns out to be false, then we're going to be forced to the conclusion that Jim did not in fact commit the murder. Critics of my argument tend to object to the first premise. They deny that the two cases are morally similar. Typically, they say that the fact that the mixed-race child is having a lower quality of life is to be blamed on racism and not on the parent's decision to have a mixed-race child. However, I don't see how this is relevant. If one knows that somebody else will perform a wrongful act on a child, one is not morally permitted to ignore that fact in making one's own decisions. If one knows that a neighbor likes to molest children, it is wrong to send one's child to play in the neighbor's swimming pool, and thus put one's child in a situation where the child can be victimized by that wrongdoing. Now, I have a second argument in defense of Beth's decision to conceive Pebbles. The argument against Beth seems to suggest that we all have an obligation to conceive children only under the best possible circumstances. Anything less is immoral. However, if it's immoral, then almost all of us were conceived by immoral parents. Few children are conceived under ideal circumstances. Now, after having come to Beth's defense, I want you to consider the following type of case. In this case, we're considering two different policies that will have long-term implications. So let us imagine two climate change policies. Policy 1 says to take minimum steps to deal with climate change. As a result, global temperatures go up 5 degrees Fahrenheit, say 3 degrees Celsius, over the next 100 years. There is, as a result, significant coastal flooding, drought, crop failures, and the like. The other policy we're considering involves significant climate change remediation. As a result, global temperatures go up only half as much, and people living 100 years from now have a much better standard of living than those produced by the first policy. Let's add to this the assumption that policy 1 will result in an increased standard of living for the next 30 years, until the harmful effects start to kick in and everything goes downhill. For the purposes of this discussion, we need to pay attention to the fact that the policy we choose will not only determine what the climate will be like in 100 years, it'll determine who will exist in 100 years. It's going to influence who meets who has sex with who, which sperm fertilizes which egg. As a result, the people who will be alive in 100 years under Policy 1 will not be the same people as those who will be alive under Policy 2. Think of it this way. Assume that in 1992, with the Kyoto Agreement, the governments of the world decided to take the problem of climate change seriously. They imposed a high global carbon tax and used the money for massive investments in renewable energy. Assuming that you are less than 30 years old, the results of that commitment would not have been to have you living in a world with less climate change and more renewable energy. The results would have been that you did not exist at all. The sperm and the egg that brought you into the world would never have met. Somebody else would be here in your place, living in that world with less climate change and more renewable energy. Given these facts, if we adopt policy 1 and enjoy a better standard of living over the next 30 years before everything goes south, who would be the victim? We can go through the same type of list we went through with Beth having the blind child. Would the people who will be alive in 100 years be our victims? They would not have existed if we had selected option 2. A different group of people would have enjoyed the benefits. They can hardly complain that our choice made them worse off. Our choice gave them their existence. What about the people who would have lived if we had chosen option 2? Were they our victims? Recall, nobody has a right to exist. No woman has an obligation to bring any child into existence. And every choice a woman makes determines which future people will exist and which will not. No particular future person has a right to demand of the woman that they choose that person over some other possibility. So is the present generation the victim? If we choose the policy option that allows us to enjoy a higher quality of life over the next 30 years, it'd be hard to argue that we are victimizing ourselves by doing so. So who, if anybody, can make a legitimate complaint against us if we choose policy 1 and enjoy 30 years of increased happiness before the world starts to burn? The puzzle is that most people do believe that we have an obligation to choose policy 2. The problem is with explaining how this can be the case. I don't have time left in this video to consider possible answers to this problem. I'll create another video where I go over those options. I do want to say one more thing before moving on. I want to bring attention to the fact that utilitarian moral theories have no problem with this type of case. Utilitarianism argues for producing the greatest good for the greatest number. Conceiving rocky rather than pebbles, and policy 2 over policy 1 meet that criteria. This is a problem with deontological theories, not with utilitarian theories. However, utilitarianism has its own problems, which I discuss elsewhere, such as the repugnant conclusion. So this isn't a knockdown argument in favor of utilitarian over deontological theories. So in summary, the question to be answered is, can we argue for a moral obligation to choose a policy that provides benefits for future generations when the policy itself will determine who will exist? Does the fact that Pebbles and Rocky are not the same person means that Beth has no obligation to choose to conceive Rocky rather than Beth? And if it does the fact that a policy will determine which group of people will exist in the future mean that we have no obligation to choose policy 2 over policy 1? I'll be addressing that question in the next video.